Nothing taco. Now we have to take a little bit of credit for this because our movement over the course of 2 years got out thousands of copies of this dossier, which you've maybe hopefully have picked up in the field, maybe you've shared with your friends. And this is a dossier above and beyond anything that you heard on any of the media, including Fox, because it went into the higher elements of who controls and deploys the likes of Robert Mueller. And that still hasn't been resolved. These people are still at large. And I want to tell you that for our movement, the LaRouche movement, this is something quite personal, because long before Robert Mueller came down on his vendetta against President Trump, long before his stint on behalf of George W. Bush as his FBI director, covering up the authors of the September 11th terror attacks, or his stint as legal counsel to the elder Bush, justifying the Christmas invasion of Panama, Robert Mueller came after us. And Mike, maybe you could show the first picture there. This is a picture of something that I witnessed that happened on October 6, 1986, in a little hamlet called Leesburg, Virginia, that was put under military occupation that day by Robert Mueller. I mean, maybe some of you were horrified by the Roger Stone raid that happened in early February. I will tell you, the Leesburg raid was 10 times as big. Armored personnel carriers, sledgehammers, machine guns, people pulled out of their beds at the crack of dawn, all to supposedly get evidence for a case that Mueller and his then boss, William Weld, who's now in the running against President Trump as a Republican, a case they had put together against Lyndon LaRouche and his associates. And I also want to tell you that when that case went to trial up there in Boston, there was not exactly a nothing taco at the end, but the jury at the end of it all declared LaRouche innocent. Now, it was not an official acquittal because a little bit of evidence that showed up in the courtroom from the a couple of memos that Oliver North neglected to shred convinced the judge that this was a politically motivated vendetta and ordered a search of then Vice President Bush's office for exculpatory material and evidence. And the government panicked through its own case. We declared there was a mistrial, and the jury held a press conference and told the Boston Herald newspaper that they would have declared LaRouche not guilty. But at that point, the government went to a different venue, Alexandria, Virginia, in the backyard of Washington, D.C., where they could control the judge, the jury, and certainly the media. And they brought a real sledgehammer down on LaRouche and his movement. And the week that that President Bush took the oath of office, Lyndon LaRouche went to federal prison for 15 years, and some of his associates for as much as 50 to 75 years. So we can't let this thing sit. I mean, there is genuine reason to be happy at the demise of Mueller's investigation, but as people that have read through this pamphlet know, that we were going after much bigger elements, the elements of British intelligence, the role, of course, of Christopher Steele, Dearlove, MI6, why was the British Empire targeting this president? We're going to talk about that for a little bit. But this did begin to come out toward the end. Take a look here. This is a little tweeting that went back and forth just as the Mueller investigation was wrapping up. Tulsi Gabbard, a war veteran but also anti-war spokesman, congresswoman from Hawaii, says short-sighted politicians and media pundits who've spent the last 2 years accusing Trump as a Putin puppet have brought us the expensive new Cold War and arms race. How? Because Trump now does everything he can to prove he's not Putin's puppet, even if it brings us closer to nuclear war. It's a very sobering thing to think about. And in response to that, a blogger named William Democratic, I think it's called Disobedient Media, says Russiagate was designed in part to help the UK, that's the United Kingdom, counter Russian influence by baiting the United States into taking a hard line against them. Leaves us all with a more dangerous world as a consequence. Just another episode of the great game. So, and President Trump himself picked up on this and tweeted it, so he had picked up on it as well. And when you're talking about the UK, you're talking about the United Kingdom, you're getting closer to home. But of course, we're not talking about a nation. We're talking about an empire that functions through cultural subversion, offshore money operations, manipulating the way people think, usually manipulating both the left and the right side of the political equation. And you have to ask yourself, well, Mueller spent all this money. We can understand, that they didn't want a president that was breaking out of their orbit. But why did they go after LaRouche? I mean, he had no power. What did he have? He simply had the power of ideas. And that is what is going to make the difference at this point in history. So with this behind us, there was another development which I will point your attention to, is that as soon as the Mueller investigation was closed, President Trump announced that we are going to accelerate the space program. He put forward a perspective where we could actually see a manned mission landing on the south pole of the moon by 2024, a mere 4.5 to 5 years away. That's an awesome and astounding undertaking, which is doable under the right circumstances, I'm convinced. But right now, those circumstances really do not exist. And so that's part of our mission. But the big development of the week is perhaps one that slipped under your radar screen altogether. But that is embodied in this picture here. And this happened over in Rome, Italy. And what you see here is a very cordial meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Italian, very young Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, on the occasion of the coming together to sign a memorandum of understanding for Italy to join the Belt and Road Initiative, to become the first G7, G8 major European power to link up with the stupendous infrastructure, trans-Eurasian and beyond infrastructure development initiative, which certainly China takes the major credit for in terms of expediting this, but actually, as we're going to develop, this also came out of the fertile mind of Lyndon LaRouche and also Helga LaRouche, who deserves great credit. So what you saw, now leading up to this event, the LaRouche movement had an event about a week before in Milano. What you see from the far right is Liliana Guerini, who's the head of the Movie Soul, our sister organization in Italy, Helga Sepp LaRouche, Claudio Celani, who's the EIR correspondent for Italy. And then on the far left is Michele Geraci. Michele Geraci is an undersecretary for economic affairs for the current Italian government. He chairs, I think they call it their China project. He's fluent in Chinese himself. And so he spoke at our event, as a sitting member of the current Italian government. Now, how did we figure this out? Did we just jump onto this Belt and Road thing lately? Well, there was a lot of back and forth in the media, and someone put it to the former economics minister, whose name is Julio Tremonti, and here's what he said. He said, the new Silk Road is a project that dates back to the mid-90s of the American visionary Lyndon LaRouche, who saw it as the salvation of humanity. Since then, the Chinese plans have been articulated along various lines. Beijing, apart from its financial infrastructure, is developing along the Eurasian, Arctic, and southern routes. Italy is part of the latter, which means Sicily, Trieste, and Genoa. So that was in Corriere della Sera on March the 12th. And I will tell you, this really precipitated an uproar in the Italian media. And let's remember, once again, that Lyndon LaRouche passed on to the everlasting next step in this path of eternity that we are all on February 12th, Lincoln's birthday. But to hear his ideas are ripping through the Italian media. Tramonti e il visionario LaRouche, right? Pro and con, the Vatican newspaper weighed in, and so forth and so on. Who did this? How did this happen, right? And even Tramonti began to back off a little bit, because when you mention the L word, expect to get a little flack, but just enjoy it, okay? But anyway, but what came out on this, and what also came out around the many obituaries, there was one just yesterday from the London Times of all places, right? Who is LaRouche? Is he a left-winger? Is he a right-winger? Is he this or is he that? You know, who is it, LaRouche? Where does he come from? And so we need to think about that, because LaRouche isn't here anymore to give us day-to-day guidance, and so we have to, insofar as we can, replicate and advance what he gave to us. And I'll just say, as a young boy up in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, Lynn had a best friend, and his best friend's name was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He says he picked up a book called Monadology on his grandma's bookshelf of great classics. And it's quite a unique work of a universal thinker, which I can't begin to do justice here, but it presents an ordering principle of the cosmos from the infinitesimal all the way up to the infinite, where the ordering principle, the little kernel of creative thought, or the generative kernel that defines the universe all the way up to the mind of God. He presents it as the monad. Think about the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So what is a word? A word is an idea made manifest, right? And so it's this creative pulse that is the generating principle of the universe, that can only in the human species become self-conscious, right? And self-conscious in a way that one's creative activity is identical with the mind of the creator itself. And this is not only a very profound philosophical idea, but it's a very important economic idea. You know, and I have this, I'm usually out in the field organizing, I try anyway, and people get all hung up on, you know, money and markets and dividends and stocks and bonds and this and that. And I say, well, you know, what is the source of wealth, right? Well, money? Yeah, well, try to eat this, right? I mean, can you know, is there any real nutrition in a dollar bill, right? Or is it gold? Well, King Midas found out that really doesn't do you much good, right? No, it's the creative spark of human creativity and how it can transform nature, right? And the questions of credit and finance and the like, you know, have to encourage that. That's how republics should work. You want to have smart, creative human beings, right, to have a properly functioning society, not a bunch of docile slaves and peons to be kept down by an oligarchy. So this is what defined LaRouche's outlook. And, you know, he read other philosophers off that bookshelf. There's a whole gaggle of British philosophers. Thomas Hobbes, who says we're in a war of each against all. Locke, who says that define the social contract between master and slave, right? Isaac Newton, whose whole universe is these mechanistic hard balls, bouncing off each other without, direction or purpose, right? Even Darwin, whose view of the selection of the species carried over to his belief of the races, the strong survive, the weak perish. But of course, Lynn never had that, and so this developed his identity, his companionship, intellectual companionship with Leibniz early on. Now, I'm going to present something else by Leibniz. He was a man who was thinking in the big terms, just like LaRouche. I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement, so that as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. I do not think it an accident that the Russians, whose vast realm connects Europe with China, and who hold sway over the deep barbarian lands of the north by the shore of the frozen ocean, should be led to the emulation of our ways through the strenuous efforts of their present ruler, Peter the Great, who Leibniz was also working with. So with that in mind, we're looking at this wonderful summit that just happened, and leading into that, Xi Jinping gave a greeting to the Italian people that was also published in Corriere della Sera, of which I'm going to read some of it. This is from the president of China speaking to the Italian people. China and Italy are the emblems of Eastern and Western civilization and have written some of the most important and significant chapters in the history of human civilization. Italy is the home of ancient Roman civilization and the cradle of the Renaissance, and its heritage of great monuments, artistic and literary masterpieces is now known widely in China. The contacts between these two great civilizations, Chinese and Italian, have their roots in history. More than 2,000 years ago, the ancient Silk Road allowed the connection between ancient China and ancient Rome, despite the great distances that separated them. The Han Dynasty sent Gan Ying on a quest to find out what they called the Da Qin, or Great Qin, which referred to the Roman Empire, which in the poems of the poet Virgil and the Roman geographer Pomponio Mela, there are multiple quotations of the country of silk. Later, the Milione of Marco Polo unleashed the first passion for China of Western history, and its author became a pioneer of contacts between the Oriental and Western cultures and models and the ambassadors of friendship. And later on, he talks about how he says the Chinese and Italian peoples have also shown great interest in the study of one another's culture. A Chinese professor began to translate Dante's Divine Commedia at the age of 70, and the work turned out to be so difficult that it was only after 18 years on his deathbed that he was able to complete it. So he was reaching greatly into the soul of the Italian people with this introduction. But you don't have to fear us. We respect each other's culture, and we can be enriched by each other's culture. I don't know if you can make that same kind of appeal to the American people. One hoping you could. We have to find that reserve of culture and beauty among our fellow Americans. So I'm going to just go race through some of this history, because it is important for those of us. Some we know and some we don't know. But here you have, we all know what was wrong with the Roman Empire. First of all, because it was an empire. But one thing Rome was pretty good on was infrastructure, bridges, aqueducts, running water, highways, roads, and the like. So that's an aqueduct on the left. And this fellow, Gan Ying, he came over, as I'm told, about 150 AD, and at least made it as far as the Black Sea. He wrote extensively on the wonders of the Roman Empire. And as Xi Jinping said, there was knowledge coming from the other direction, although I couldn't find the references in Virgil he was talking about. So you had this a regular route of commerce that was established between the Chinese Empire, called the Silk Road, because the Chinese had mastered this technique of creating this beautiful and lush and luxurious fabric called silk, which they kept it a secret for many, many centuries. But also it was porcelain, it was spices, and it was ideas, because you were cutting across the great religious and cultural divides, which I think are somewhat represented on the bottom of that if you look at the various churches and mosques and ziggurats and so forth on the bottom there. But of course there was always an oligarchy that had an agenda which we today call geopolitics, always based on divide and conquer and the division of the races and the regions and the ethnicities, right? And this centered for centuries around Venice, but there was also a different sort of oligarchy in Byzantium, which was a very important hub for the Silk Road, because that was the entry point into the Black Sea. And so if you were going by sea through the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, or over the land bridge at the Dardanelles, you had to pass through this great big toll booth at Constantinople or Byzantium. And so you had also, oh yes, of course, Marco Polo. We're told in the about 1230 or so, Marco Polo embarked from Venice with his father eastward, and he says he made it all the way to China and even became an advisor to the Great Khan. There's some doubt of that, but he at least made it as far as Persia, and some of his work may have been hearsay that he picked up through rumors. But one thing you should know about Marco Polo is that the most famous work that he wrote that became a bestseller was written in prison. He spent years and years of his life in prison. He was captured in Genoa and thrown in jail, and he dictated this work. So there are occasions in history where people write works from prison that can change the world, and this was one of them. And I'm sure he later on inspired another guy from Genoa, who we will talk about a little bit later. But in any event, twice the Venetians organized the looting and the destruction of Constantinople. One was during one of the Crusades. They went in there and said, we're going to Jerusalem, and then they made a left turn and then zipped up to Constantinople and looted the place. But then secondly, in league with what were the Seljuk Turks, Constantinople fell. I think it was like about 1454 or thereabouts, and that was it. That was the end of the Silk Road. There was no way to keep this commerce going at that point. It was a shocking, traumatic event. Also, the which is that for all of its problems, Constantinople had been the center of the Orthodox Church, and that fell into the hand of the Muslim infidels, as they said, the Turks. And so this was also a traumatic event for mankind, for the European philosophers and religious leaders. So what were they going to do about it? Well, one of our factional allies, Nicholas of Cusa, who also inspired particularly Helga LaRouche in her youth, wrote passionately about how you had to have ecumenical dialogue between the religions. He had helped pull together a religious council that had pulled together temporarily the Orthodox and the Catholic Church to try to have a military alliance, but that didn't that didn't succeed in saving Constantinople. But one of his allies, Toscanelli, produced this map, which you see below, passed it on to another Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus. And so very much the founding of America, and ultimately what led to the founding of our nation, the discovery of America in modern times, was very much about reaching out to the Pacific, to reestablish the maritime Silk Road, as it were. That's what Columbus's voyage was all about. So now I'm going to skip ahead into the 19th and 20th century here, because where we talked about Leibniz and the great leaders, Cusa, always reaching out around the universal ideas of man, which were realized in the establishment, at least in principle, of the U.S. Republic with the American Revolution and what followed from that. The British Empire had quite a different concept of man, as identified in the writings of this fellow here. This is Rudyard Kipling. He was absolutely a white supremacist. He was the one that wrote this poem, Take Up the White Man's Burden, which was his letter to America, that we should become an empire like the British Empire. And he wrote this other work, which you see here, Oh, East is East, and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. Okay, that there's just this insuperable divide between East and West, that of course they can play both sides and control the world. And that's how empires work, geopolitics, divide and conquer. And what you see here on the top, that's the Opium Wars. This is when the British went into China, which China had been the richest nation in the world, but also somewhat insulated, right, from the world. And the British insisted on the right to trade, but they had nothing. They really had nothing they could trade in return for the goods and the merchandise they were getting from China, except for silver, and they didn't want to give all that up. And so they came up with something that we're gonna sell them opium, right? Free trade, don't you know? Supply and demand. So they created the demand, and they created the supply. And when the Chinese resisted, they went to war with them twice for the right to dump opium on them. And this was the beginning of what the Chinese people call their century of humiliation, an entire century where they were just brought down and humiliated and degraded as a people, something that still exists within their psyche. This should never happen again. Now about going into the 20th century, you had a very extraordinary intellectual and individual come forward to lead the Chinese people, named Sun Yat-sen, who had come over to be educated in Hawaii, was part of in the network of economists and thinkers tied to Abraham, the old Abraham Lincoln Republican networks, right? And his vision was to go back. He saw how, and bring that to China. He saw how Lincoln had united our nation with the railroads, right? And what you see is the map of the railroad networks that he wanted to, introduce into China. But you see something bad had happened in the United States going into the turn of the 20th century. You'd had the assassination of 3 American presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley, where McKinley was the last Union soldier, the last Lincoln Republican, you'd have to say, to serve in the presidency. And he was replaced by an Anglophile Yahoo named Teddy Roosevelt with his big stick, which he used to beat up on smaller nations to collect on their debt. And so there was nobody home in Washington, no one home in the United States that would assist Sun Yat-sen to help bring this dream of a modern, advanced China into being. And in fact, the British interests were putting their bets on the other side, on communist networks that were coming to challenge him, and this was being played out in the period around World War II and its aftermath. And with the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and with a cold shoulder being turned to the Kuomintang, the Kuomintang escaped to Taiwan, as we know, and Alfred, I'm just showing here, this was the network of railroads that Sun Yat-sen wanted to build in China, which he had modeled on what Abraham Lincoln wanted to do. But because the U.S. had gone sour, and by linking up with the British Empire going into World War I, this did not happen, or it certainly did not happen then. Now, what also happened is that the British, sensing the winds of change, sent one of their most despicable, evil agents over there to China, Bertrand Russell, to get in on the ground floor of the communist revolution, and he met with the CP leadership. He wrote this book called The Problem of China. And what's the argument? The argument is that the reason China has been so humiliated, the reason your nation was defeated and brought down, is because of this ancient belief in Confucius, right? Confucius is the problem, and what you need is an amoral, materialist philosophy, and you have to reject Confucius. And so a certain kind of atheistic poison was introduced into the communist ideology through Bertrand Russell early on. But anyway, China kind of limped through the 20th century, and as it was opened up, here are two kind of interesting individuals you have to wonder about, right? And one on the left is George Bush and Barb over there in front of the Forbidden City. Bush was their first emissary to China before China was actually recognized under the Jerry Ford administration. And then, of course, we all know Henry Kissinger. Now, I should say it's actually Sir George Bush and Sir Henry Kissinger. They were both knighted by the Queen for their many atrocities and services to the empire. But of course, if you consider the China back then, the China in the world of geopolitics that they thought could be pitted against Russia, the China that was, willingly to exploit its own population with cheap labor to fill the Walmarts and, discount stores of this country with cheap consumer products, you could, right, and, the one child per couple policy and all of this, you could see how they would, consider, themselves as friends to that China that was obediently under the sway of the ideology of the empire. But someone else went to China about the same time. This lady right here. And this is Helga Zepp, not Helga Zepp LaRouche yet. This picture is probably taken about 10 years later, but she was the first Western journalist into China as the Cultural Revolution was moving on, right? And what she saw was a nation of poverty, of misery, where the main form of transportation was a bicycle, and this stuck with her, and it's whereas, the left in that period of the 60s often had a kind of a romantic admiration of Maoism and the simple people working in the countryside and all that. Helga didn't have any of these illusions. And she carried this with her, even before she bumped into LaRouche and this movement. So I want to go back to Italy now. The nation of Italy is actually newer as a nation than the United States. Italy as a nation didn't come into existence until the 1860s and 70s and 80s. As we know, the Roman Empire finally fell, was overrun by barbarians. Italy broke up into various fiefdoms and dukedoms, and if you've ever read Romeo and Juliet, these counter-gang wars between the families and so forth. But one individual that really began to define Italy as a nation is this fellow that Xi Jinping talked about, Dante Alighieri, right? Now, he was banished from his own city of Florence in a fight between the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs, and he never came back. And he spent the rest of his life kind of wandering around Italy. He was, and one of the things, and he composed this masterwork, the Commedia. But in it, he pulled the best of all the dialects together for something that defined the Italian language, which anyone that listens to opera knows, or poetry. It's the most beautiful language in the world. It's just fused with poetry. And of course, this is an interesting picture because he shows hell on the left, purgatory in the middle, and paradise. Now, of course, that city that he's looking at is Florence. It's obvious, but that city hadn't been built yet. Or it was Florence, but certainly that dome hadn't been built in Dante's mortal life. So here he is letting the future determine the present, looking into the future. Now, speaking of that, here we have a picture of that beautiful Il Duomo in Florence, which I've never seen, but Evelyn and maybe some of the other people here have. But it's on a book. It's on the cover of a book that Mr. LaRouche wrote while in prison, son of a gun. You see, it's on the bottom here, and that dome was the embodiment of this idea of man in the image of God as a creative individual, right? It was under this dome that Cusa brought together the leaders of the Orthodox and the Catholic churches for the Council of Florence. And this is and they did temporarily fuse the two churches. And what had kept the two churches apart was, if people are familiar with the Nicene Creed, it says that and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son. The Orthodox Creed does not say and from the Son. Now, is this an arcane point? Well, no, because the Spirit is the creative spark. The creative spark only comes from the Father. That means really creation kind of ended, with the Big Bang, and that's it, right? But, and I don't think Orthodox people believe that, but nonetheless, in Western Christian doctrine, as worked out, was that that Spirit also proceeds from the Son, i.e., also from man, right? That we have a capacity, capax Dei, but also an obligation to use that creative spark for the greater good, right? And of course, I am convinced that we're more likely to get to that south pole of the moon in 4 years than to figure out really how to build that dome again. I don't think we could do it today, right? I mean, that was such an amazing accomplishment. And I'll say another thing here. Of course, another thing about Italy is that Italy is the home to the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church has been a battleground for forever, right, of ideas. I mean, in his Commedia, Dante consigns 3 or 4 popes to hell, in the Commedia, because they had become instruments of the oligarchy and the oppression, and that has happened, particularly during the 19th century. For example, when the Catholic Church, sided with the Confederacy and with the Habsburgs down there in Mexico and so forth. But on the other hand, in the period in the founding, as Italy was coming together, you had also positive direction in the Catholic Church with Pope Leo, wrote an encyclical called Rerum Novarum on the dignity of the working man, and a series of popes, leading up to the 60s, Pope Paul VI, Pope Lorem Progressio, about it's our obligation to help the oppressed, to help the poor, to lift nations out of poverty. And here you have a picture of a currency that doesn't currently exist but may come back again one of these days, called the lira, because all the regional currencies have been abolished in Europe in favor of the euro. But when you had the lira, I guess it's 1,000 lira, who do they see as the father of their country?
Joe Green.
Yeah, mean Joe Green, right? Giuseppe Verdi, right? Because he created, as Schiller did. In fact, he drew upon Schiller, a popular culture to understand profound ideas. Well, you know, many of these operas are assailing the consequences of being motivated by revenge. You know, the characters that are trying to seek vengeance, it always comes back to destroy them. It eats away at their soul, like Rigoletto. You know, they corrupt themselves by seeking vengeance against somebody else. So this is something that's very dear to the heart of thinking Italians. It came up at our conference in Manhattan a few weeks ago when Liliana Guerini spoke. John Singer said, "What is it about Italy that makes it so open to your ideas?" And this is an element of it. So, so anyway, our movement, you know, which goes back 50 years, you know, Lyndon LaRouche as a singular individual, motivated by this creative identity and a real pungent understanding of the evil of the British Empire, dating back to his presence in Calcutta at the end of World War II. You know, he began to build an international movement from scratch. I'm showing you here one of our little weekly newspapers from, I think this is about 1971 or 72. Italy organizes European Oil Consortium champions Third World fight in Europe. Right, this was always a question of Italy, you know, being held hostage, both as a NATO member, but also, you know, on the oil question by the Seven Sisters to try to find an independent source of energy to develop their own population. What the NATO networks also were able to do was always play the left-wing, right-wing game, you know, to tear that country apart, right? And including many gross terror incidents, which we covered in our paper. But we had a presence in there as early in Italy. This is obviously an American page here, but we've had a presence in Italy of our movement since at least the mid-70s. Now this is one, I'm going to touch upon a couple of fights that we got involved in Italy, right? There was a prime minister named Aldo Moro, who was prime minister 3 times. I think he left in 1976, but as an elder gentleman, respected individual, he was pulling together a coalition government where the Communist Party would be brought in some fashion with the Christian Democrats, you know, to unify Italy, to stop the partisan fighting, begin to get a government of national unity and move forward, right? Think in terms of 1978. Jimmy Carter was president, Volcker was chairman of the Federal Reserve. You had a big oil price shock. You remember that around the Khomeini Revolution and so forth. So, so Aldo Moro is pulling together, and the very day that they were going to sign the agreement to bring the CP into the government, his car was attacked. 5 bodyguards were killed. You know, Moro was kidnapped, and for 55 days he was held in captivity. We found out subsequently that NATO took over the police of Rome during that period, you know, and the investigations. And, you know, but this was just a horrible thing. And, you know, but the Vatican was willing to, you know, they were trying to do some secret negotiations to get him released. But then a phone call came in, you're going to find his body in the trunk of his Renault just around the corner, right? So we put out this book, you know, it's called Who Killed Aldo Moro, right? And this resulted in a bunch of parliamentarians, you know, lining up with us. It's something that haunts Italy to the present day, just like the Kennedy assassination haunts all Americans, right? And we pointed the finger at Henry Kissinger in this. You know, Henry Kissinger was one of the key. Kissinger hated Moro. He threatened him many times, right? Kissinger was going to be arrested if he came into Italian territory and brought in for questioning, you know. But anyway, so that was one of our battles back in the 70s, right? But here's another very interesting one that Mr. LaRouche initiated on this very question dear to the Italian people, which is this question of music. Is music arbitrary, right? If you pick out a piece on the piano, right, can you play it at any old tune or any old key, or is it grounded in the universe? And of course, LaRouche believes everything is harmonious and lawful, and music is something that's reflected and reflects the ordering of the universe itself, as did Kepler and many other people. And so he put forward this hypothesis that middle C should be at C equals 256, which is a little bit lower than the standard tuning. And Liliana did the research, and she found out yes, that's what Verdi wanted. That these operas, these great works of music, were designed to be written in for a very specific vocal register. I think the lady is Antonella Banaudi, right? But we put out a petition on this that we should return to the Verdi tuning, and this was signed by Carlo Bergonzi, Piero Cappuccilli, Luciano Pavarotti, Placido Domingo, Montserrat Caballé, Renata Tebaldi, who spoke at one of our events there, right? We did not succeed in getting the law passed, but everyone remembers LaRouche from that. So that gives you a sense of our grounding now in Italy. So anyway, our movement continued to move forward. LaRouche ran for president in 1976, and he as U.S. Labor Party, and then he became a Democrat to challenge what I would have to say is the greening of the Democratic Party, that came in with Jimmy Carter. In other words, the pro-science, the pro-progress, the pro-future orientation that John F. Kennedy represented, we were going to bring that back. And so here you see Mr. LaRouche and Ronald Reagan, elbow to elbow, at a campaign event in New Hampshire in 1980. And at that time, we had a big scientific foundation called Fusion Energy Foundation, right? And of course, LaRouche always believed, his first TV address to the nation in 1976 was talking about, that we always on the precipice of nuclear war, from this nuclear standoff. This is an intolerable situation. And I remember I joined about that time. We put out a pamphlet in 1978 on beam weapons and what the Russians might be doing on that. But in any event, Ronald Reagan liked the idea. They were both World War II vets, and the idea that both Russia and the United States could deploy these anti-missile systems to neutralize ICBMs before hitting their target, that was going to bring the end of an era of mutual and assured destruction. Okay. And Mr. LaRouche was deployed to Russia by certain patriots around the Reagan team to discuss joint deployment of this capability. It's a tragedy because the president, or Yuri Andropov at the time, who was a kind of a contaminated individual, turned down that offer. But there was going to be one last opportunity for President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to sit down and negotiate that. And this was to happen in Reykjavik, Iceland. This was the opportunity where Reagan was going to make the last offer to Gorbachev for jointly deploying the research and development of these anti-missile systems. And Gorbachev came into that meeting with the demand that the U.S. give it up altogether, that we give up the capability. October 6, 86. Now, what happened that day? There's the picture you saw. This was the great Leesburg raid. I woke up that morning with, black helicopters flying around the city of Leesburg, 400 FBI agents, machine guns, Uzis, armored personnel carriers, all deployed by Robert Mueller. Behind him, William Weld, and behind him, George Bush. Okay? And so our correspondent up in Iceland, we had two at that summit, while waiting for the outcome of the summit, we're watching CNN, and this was what was on CNN that day, the great, panty raid, as we called it, against the Leesburg, headquarters, right? So, once again, as I remind you, that case that was supposedly a secure evidence came to a mistrial. The jury declared LaRouche innocent, but there was a second prosecution that was launched in Alexandria, Virginia. where the Department of Justice had everything under control, and the week that George Bush, the elder, Mr. New World Order, took the presidency, Lyndon LaRouche, January 27th, 1989, was put in handcuffs and hauled off to the federal penitentiary for 15 years. Okay, so think about 1989. This is January of 1989. You know, the lower picture on the lower right is May of 1989. That's Tiananmen Square, right, where the consequence of this, you know, exploitative sweatshop labor, you know, policy in China finally caught up with them. Massive, massive demonstrations, right, which were put down. But then what? And then in October, November of '89, you had the candlelight visuals in Leipzig, you know. Fall of the Berlin Wall, great new opportunity for mankind, right? The end of the artificial division of the world, right? Where's the world going to go from here? First of all, where's Europe going to go from here? And so LaRouche was not just sitting in prison. He began to design the ideas, you know, that to take civilization forward at this moment. The initial idea was called the triangle, the idea that you could fast forward industrialization of Europe, stretching from Berlin to Paris to Vienna, right? And then spider webs of development into Russia and Eastern Europe, south into Africa and so forth. Well, that didn't happen. That couldn't happen because Europe was practically at the point of a gun, you know, was brought into the Maastricht Treaty and then the Euro, the European Union, where they lost all sovereign decisions over their economics altogether, you know. So so they had to rethink things from a larger standpoint, and that's where Lynn began to think in larger terms. Now, Helga, Mrs. LaRouche, valiantly, you know, went around the world to seek her husband's freedom. A huge international outcry for the freedom of Lyndon LaRouche. You know, and this took her to Hungary, to Poland, to Ukraine, to Russia, but also to China. Remember, she had been the first Western journalist into China after the fall of the Berlin, after the Cultural Revolution.
Does she speak Chinese?
I don't think so. Maybe a little bit, but we have certain members of our movement that do. But any event, there were certain inflection points, like you remember the Asia Tiger crash, which I think happened in now LaRouche was out of prison by then. But nonetheless, you know, the idea that Lynn had, right, of this, which we called the New Silk Road, that we could open up these overland rail routes, overcome the geopolitical divides through bringing legs of development to the underdeveloped regions. This made sense, right? And China was almost destroyed around that period of 1989. As we know, subsequently, George Soros and Gene Sharp were funding student operations to tear everything apart. You also have the Dalai Lama thing up there in Tibet to split that piece of China off. So they had to deal with poverty. They had to deal with the backwardness. And China, what they did is they began by, you know, that old map that I showed you of Sun Yat-sen, right? They pulled it out of mothballs and they began to build it. They built 20,000 miles of high-speed rail in about, you know, a decade and a half. An amazing accomplishment to unite their country. You know, 1998 they had a conference for the on the idea of the land bridge, which Helga was an invited guest to. You also had a guy named Sir, I think his name was Britann, you know, saying, oh, everything has to be private. Everything has to be private financing. No, you need government credit, right? You don't need to have some mortgage bond held by some London or Wall Street banker who can foreclose upon your railroad if you can't pay the bill. Government credit, right? So you see Helga on the bottom, you know, giving a class at one of these Chinese universities, a press conference there at the eastern terminus of the Eurasian Land Bridge. There she is over on the far right. Exclusive interview with the New Silk Road lady, Helga LaRouche, right? Now, what was going on in Italy? Well, Italy was sucked into Euroland. They lost their sovereignty over economic decisions, right? The lira was gone, right? And also so the European Central Bank was dictating policies always to their disadvantage. One inflection point was in 1992, where this little yacht, the Britannia, parked off the coast of Italy with the Queen herself there, discussing just the buy-up of Italy's state assets, right? And, real flea market, bargain basement, right? And they swooped in there with their money, and they had a compliant government at that point. Yes, we'll do anything to draw down our deficit. And, a lot of these companies that had been built up over generations were just sold off, auctioned off. People committing suicide, because they lost everything, right? You had under Berlusconi, there was a plan, which Tremonti was part of, where they wanted to negotiate with Libya to get an independent source of oil. They had worked out a deal with Libya based on the fact that Mussolini had occupied, Libya, and during the 30s. So in the name of reparations, they were going to get a direct oil line in exchange for Italian technology to develop, Libya, water and other kind of resources. Well, we know where that went. This was during the Obama period, right? And of course, you see NATO's responsibility to protect. Oh yes, we have to protect these poor Libyans, right? And they went in there and lynched Gaddafi, killed him, right? And that whole thing went down, right? And so what happens predictably, right? You've got poverty, you've got despair, you've got regional wars in Africa, and you have the fleeing of millions and millions of refugees, desperation, getting on these boats. Now, if you get on a boat from Libya or, northern Africa, Egypt, go north, what do you hit first? You hit Sicily, you hit Italy, and you hit Greece. These are the three nations that became the recipients of more refugees than anybody, right? What are we going to do about it? Are we going to kick them back into the ocean again, or can we absorb them, the poorest nations in Europe? So this is a crisis for the nation as a whole, right? Italy went through several different governments. This is a march against the austerity of the young people, right? No jobs, no opportunities, marching in Rome, smoke bombs and so forth, right? So we were still there. Mr. LaRouche, after he was released from prison after 5 years, we got him out on parole after Bill Clinton became president, had a continuing and ongoing presence. In the lower left corner, I think this is an economist named Galoni. Here he is on the upper right, speaking at the Chamber of Deputies of Scalo Paceno, right? There he's speaking at a university to the students on a speech called "What is Creativity?" Right? And so at the La Sapienza University, what is creativity? Right? We also got a resonance for certain aspects of what we call LaRouche's 4 laws. Right? The first of which is Glass-Steagall. Right? Glass-Steagall was a Roosevelt law that separated legitimate banking from speculative finance. You protect legitimate banking that does what banks are supposed to do, that gets insurance, that's protected from the speculative stuff, right? Now, that began to resonate because under the Euro Treaty, you didn't have that, right? So when banks go under, like there's a very famous Florentine bank. Does anybody remember the name of it?
The Vatican's bank?
Yeah.
Well,
Monte
Piasca or something.
Yeah.
Right. Went under, right, Monte de Pace de Siendo, right? Then the Euro, Siena, the Euro, people say, well, you have to cough up the money and bail it out or bail it in, I mean, you know, these banks would issue bonds and say, you know, we're going to put all your pensions and stuff into these bonds, right? And then the bank would go under and people would lose everything. You know, thousands of suicides, elderly, senior citizens, right? Right? So what's Italy going to do, you know? This is from our EIR about certain developments that happened. Let me skip ahead and then I might go back. You had in the last round of elections a combination which you would say, wow, this is like a Trump phenomenon, right? This was like the Bernie Sanders phenomenon in the Democratic Party, right? But even more pronounced. The guy on the upper right is a comedian named Beppe Grillo. I don't know if people remember Lenny Bruce, or here in Texas we have a guy named Kinky Friedman, right? Right? And you know, this was a guy whose whole thing, he was a comedian attacking the corruption in the government, you know, and making a resonance with people, right? We're mad as hell and we ain't going to take it anymore, right? He was banned from TV because he was so foul-mouthed, you know. So basically the 5-star movement, which he was one of the founders of, grew up on the internet. That's how this movement came together, right? Now what's on the lower left? Lega Nord Padania, right? This was the one of the early car caravans for Lega Nord. See what it says? No al voto de immigrante, right? No immigrants, right? So, you know, of course, you can see where there was resonance of people saying, you know, we can't take any more immigrants, right? So you have kind of a left-wing crazy and the right-wing anti-immigrant types, right? But our movement in Italy said we got to talk to these people. You know, we've got to talk to everybody. We've got to organize everybody, right? And you know, as I said, the Glass-Steagall thing did resonate with people, and both of these parties accepted Glass-Steagall into their platforms, as well as national banking. And you know, in the elections, they won. The Christian Democrats were thrown out, the Socialists were thrown out, the Communists were thrown out, and 5-star and the Lega Nord became the two dominant, you know, ruling parties, right, in Italy, right? But they had evolved through their conversation with LaRouche and our movement, and that's what we're talking about here. Developments in Italy offer a chance for reorganization in Europe. Now, in the first go-round when they won, the European Parliament said, no, you can't do this. You cannot do this. You're too anti-banker. You're too, you know, they actually forced the president of Italy to kick out the guy that had been appointed Treasury Secretary because he wasn't going to be subservient to the Euro dictatorship. But a coalition arrangement was worked out. And so this is a fellow that had become a friend of ours over the years. He is originally with the 5-star. He switched to be the Lega, no longer the Lega Nord, right, but the Lega. But here he is being interviewed by EIR just about 7 or 8 months ago. He came to Washington, D.C. with signatures of 270 Italian parliamentarians for Glass-Steagall, right? You know, to meet with members of Congress and so forth and to discuss this, right? And so we've educated the guy, right? And so I'll come back to that. So now he has just this last week been promoted, right? He's now the new League of Foreign Policy spokesman. Italy will bring China and the U.S. together. The European Parliament member Marco Zanni, known for his fight for Glass-Steagall and his collaboration with the LaRouche movement, has been appointed foreign policy spokesman of the Lega March 11th. In an interview with online journal Affari Italiani, March 15th, Zanni explained that Italy wants to bring the U.S. and China closer on the Belt and Road, referred to in Italy as the New Silk Road. The agreement with China does not threaten Italy's historical alliances, Zanni says. Our historical ally is Washington. The agreement with China could rather make us the trade union, the connection point between the USA, Europe, and the Asian world. It is a difficult path, but we are convinced we can accomplish it. Conditions set forth by Rome are fulfilled, Zanni says, Italy has an opportunity economically, but also geopolitically. We are witnessing a big leadership crisis in Europe, which opens a political and geopolitical room in the relationship with the USA. After Brexit and Donald Trump, Italy, with its green-yellow government experiment, can insert itself in this area of change, and thanks to its position, can become the privileged interlocutor of Washington in Europe, at the same time establishing itself as an interconnection with Asian economies. And I will tell you that when Trump met with the new premier of Italy, they hit it off pretty well. You know, you're a radical, I'm a radical. Let's talk, right? So that's not an outlandish thing. So here you have, going back to this summit that just happened. This is the president of Italy, who's actually a member of the Democratic Party. The old Christian Democratic Party is no more. It was just brought down by corruption scandals and so forth. His name is Mattarella, and he was the guy that was forced just a year ago to kick out the treasurer and so forth on orders of the euro, right? But here he is. And I will tell you, this guy's from Sicily. His brother was killed by the mafia. You know, I mean, you know, this is personal. He says, along the historical Silk Road, which our countries were the main terminal of adventurous caravans transported fabrics and spices, as well as more precious goods, ideas, inventions, innovation, and culture. The contribution to human progress was extraordinary. Like then, exchange and sharing of ideas are the pillars of the new Silk Roads in the third millennium. So that's the remarks of President Mattarella at the state dinner of the Palazzo di Chinale on March 22nd, just a few days ago. So, you know, the question is, where do we go from here? Why doesn't the U.S. plug into this? Right? Why not? Right? Well, the Mueller investigation's done. Shouldn't Trump just kind of roll up his sleeves and say, let's get going? Well, you know, every time Trump opens his mouth and says something good about China, you know, Pompeo goes out there and says something bad, or Mike Pence, you know, or Bolton. You know, you still have this totally contaminated, you know, intelligence mafia, you know, that is aimed at screwing up by whatever means the possibility of the kind of grand party relationship we need to bring to the end of empire, okay? So I just found out today, you know, we're going to actually start introducing something on our website. We may even print it, called the Rogues Gallery. You know, these guys are rogues. You know, yeah, they wormed their way into the Trump administration, but they're still no damn good. But the efficient question is, well, yes, but what are you going to do about this corruption? You want to do something efficient and corrupt to blow this whole intelligence establishment? Here's my commercial right here. See that? Can I get a picture of me there, Michael?
Yes.
Okay, exonerate Lyndon LaRouche. Right here it's even bigger. Right? Right there. This is our mission. We're going to get all those documents released, not just the documents on the Mueller stuff, but what the heck the establishment was doing to crush our movement 30 years ago. So with that in mind, where can we go from here? Well, this is one of the projects that might be seen pretty soon. This is the Messina Bridge, you know, a projection of it. You know, you see the little toe in the boot of Italy, you know, 5 kilometers across to Sicily. Why not?
Only 5 kilometers.
Yep.
Wow.
You know, and then of course if you do that, then you could then go with a tunnel to Tunisia in northern Africa, right, where the commerce and the flow of goods would start going the other way, which is beautiful, right? But here's the next. Look at this. Now this is something, and my friend Larry, this is just for you, who just showed up. Hi, Larry. Right? We pulled together this conference in Abuja recently, right? The Italian government has studied this thing. This is called Trans-Aqua, right? What is that? Well, how are you going to deal with poverty and misery and despair in Africa? You have to allow them to develop. And of course, it's not just handouts, you know, because you develop prosperous, you know, thriving republics, Yeah, right. They'll absorb the goods. You can create jobs for everyone on both sides of the Mediterranean. So the plan is that little blue dot you see up there in the map, that's Lake Chad, right? Now Lake Chad is turned almost into a mud puddle. You know, it's been shrinking for decades. And so the idea is to divert about 5% of the headwaters of the Niger and the Congo rivers northward, and replenish it and turn the whole region into a breadbasket. You see the green there. You know, right now the area around there is pretty much a desert. It's a big recruitment area for Boko Haram, a really ugly terrorist organization which is recruiting children and others out of just poverty and despair. But anyway, we pulled this conference together, and it was, you know, we weren't, you know, we made it happen. We were the catalyst that brought it together. And this China-Italy relationship can make it happen, because there's an Italian firm called Bonifica and the Chinese engineering firm, which built the biggest hydroelectric dam in the world, the Three Gorges Dam. They're interested. The Italian government kicked in 1.5 million lira, about $2 million for an initial feasibility study. So this thing is moving forward. That's one of the potentials, right? So, you know, you look at the world at night here, right? You fly over it with a satellite. You see all the electric lights over eastern United States. I guess you can see the dot where Houston is, and Western Europe. You know, where's Africa? You can barely see it, you know, because it you know, the electricity is lacking, right? We could light up that whole continent. And you know what? Mother Nature would be very happy, because you do this with, you know, nuclear energy, you couple it with proper forestation and the like. You can, you know, I mean, one of the images I don't have for you is that NASA did a flyover recently of China and India. And over the last 10 years, they have added more green forestry to planet Earth than a new Amazon rainforest, wow. You know? So my last image here is that, you know, when Lynn talks about infrastructure, he always calls it a platform. You know, infrastructure is not the end in of itself. It's a platform you build for where you're going to go, right? Where we have to go is into the cosmos and beyond. You know, I'm happy that President Trump made this announcement about going back to the moon. I don't know if you know this, but I think it was in January, a asteroid or a big fat meteor hit planet Earth, almost as big as the one that hit Chelyabinsk. This one hit up in the Bering Sea. Right, this is serious stuff. If that had hit New York City or Chicago or a city, you know, I mean, it would have been, you know, 100 times bigger than Hiroshima, right? So we have to begin to deal with these things. We have to have fruitful cooperation across the cultural divides, and we're going to discover our godlike qualities in a richer and more profound way along the way. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Do we want to turn the lights on?
Yeah.
Joe?
Did Chilani go personally to Africa?
Yes, he did. Claudio Celani was at that conference. Yes, he was. Yes.
I was just going to ask, isn't it the case that the whole meeting of the Queen and Britannia was supposed to be secret? And aren't we the ones that blew the cover on this thing?
Well, I didn't see the EIR article until 1993. It was about 6 months later.
Yeah.
So I don't think we knew about it at the time.
Oh, yeah, but I think we're the
But
ones.
we did find out about it,
Yeah.
yeah. And you had Barings and Moody's. Moody's had arranged to devalue or downgrade the credit rating, which forced Italy to pay more interest rates. It's totally sinister and cynical. But they just,
Another swipe.
what's his name?
Jogging.
Draghi, Mario Draghi. That's the name I was trying to think of. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes. Yep, that's true. And I've got something here from Lyndon at this university that he was speaking at, La Sapienza University. When you wish to communicate it, this is speaking to young people. This was in 2008. What? The name of it is La Sapienza University. Organized by Professor Bruno Brandemart in Italy. It says, when you wish to communicate an idea, which is a creative act of communication. You are forced to do something which the ordinary use of language does not allow you to do. What you will often do in the case of a poet, classical poet, is you will draw up something from the past in terms of usages of terms or concepts or words or special use of words which startle the attention of the mind, enable you to convey a question. What do they really mean by this? And it's a function of irony in composition in classical art and poetry, which expresses the creative mood, the creative mind. And then he's talking about Prometheus, fire, the power of ideas to transform the universe. So this was Lynn. In dialogue with the Italian young people. Any other questions?
When Zani was talking about the experiment in yellow and green, what is he referring to?
I
Coalition?
would probably the green refers to the 5-star because they are kind of a greeny party. This is the big battle between them. In fact, Marco Zani, the guy you saw, had been originally with the 5-star and he switched and went to the Lega. But the 5-star move is very much against infrastructure projects, which is kind of nuts because, like, remember that big bridge that fell down there? You know, who's going to rebuild it? They can't.
I think they recently made a concession to one of the projects because it was clear that, you know, their position was absolutely untenable in the face of what was going on and the opportunities right now.
Well, they're
And
always.
the change is underway. I mean, even Lega Nord was originally, like 10 years or more, was originally, you know, a party based in the northern part of Italy, which is where you have this intense industrial, high technology, you know, small family-owned, highly skilled business, very productive business center of Italy, right? And you know, their initial founding was around separating northern Italy from the rest of Italy, which was considered a lost cause economically. Well, they've changed on that, and you know, I mean, we've had influence in that, but also just the reality of dealing with finding solutions, which we've helped inform, has caused them to actually recognize the answer is not in separating or dividing up Italy. The answer is in recognizing the tremendous potential of the underdeveloped part of Italy.
Sure.
You know, Sicily and so forth, with the right orientation as a nation and internationally. So it's, you know, it's the kind of thing that.
No, did you see the picture of the green bus I showed up there?
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
that's what it said. Lega Nord, no to the immigrants. Padania, their country was going to be called Padania.
Right.
And when we in the old New Federalists, we had a picture of the head of the Lega Nord with Groucho Marx or Rufus T. Firefly in this movie called Duck Soup, where they had the leader of Padania meets the leader of Fredonia, right? You know, hail, hail, Fredonia, right?
Rules the waves.
Right, rules the waves, right? But, you know, like I said, you got to organize everybody. Because people, you know, like, I mean, we had, you know, Trump just had this big rally up in Grand Rapids, right, in Michigan now. I mean, Michigan, until the Trump election, maybe with the Reagan election, they went with Reagan because everyone hated Jimmy Carter in 1980, you know, but typically Michigan always votes Democrat. You know, it's trade union and this and that. And they voted for Trump. It was a big shock to Hillary, but she had just kissed them off. But it didn't mean that they were becoming Republicans, you know, right? It just, you know, they said, look, we're for Trump, but, you know, you got to change, right? We have to, you know, one guy was holding us on jobs, right? Yes. How are you going to pay for it? You know, when every time the Federal Reserve, you know, raises interest rates a little bit, you know, to cut off the quantitative easing, then it happened for about 6 days, and then they lower them again because things start to tremble in the financial markets, right? You know, if you don't get Glass-Steagall back to protect legitimate banking and just write off a lot of the other stuff, you know, you can't generate the credit you require to create any jobs, right? So, Alfred, did you want to say something about railroads here? I mean, you said.
Not much, just, it's, you know, I can tell you what some of the hurdles are towards railroad development in the United States, if that would be of any interest to you.
Well, you said to Marcia that you wanted to say a couple of words. Did you want to do that? Or?
No.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I've got, by the way, Larry, Ernest, I've got the Nigeria paper on Transaqua here,
Yeah,
which you
sure,
can take
sure.
just for you, okay?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you a question about the Transaqua project and who is the main, I guess, initiators and how are they planning to fund it and, you know, I know you create jobs and hopefully, you know, improve the livelihood of the, you know, indigenous people that live around there, but.
Well, this thing will make everything easier. The IMF doesn't fund any darn thing. You know, at the IMF and the World Bank, right? There's a big dam. You remember the name of the dam that they want to build there at the Inca Dam? It's toward where the Congo River empties into the ocean, right? And there's a what?
Grand Inga.
The Grand Inga Dam. And there's a place where the river makes a turn or something, and has a big drop. And it's a perfect place to put a dam, and it would create huge amounts of fresh, you know, water reservoirs, hydroelectric power, and so forth. And the World Bank, you know, after tiddling around for years, pulled out, you know, a couple of months ago and said, "Oh no, this is not environmentally friendly," you know, and so forth. So they don't want to fund anything that will really allow for real advancement. You know, the similar fight way back in the 60s around the Volta Dam in Ghana, right? So China, you know, is in the equation along with the Italians now. You know, if you read that, we pulled this conference together in Abuja. You had Republic of Congo, I think Cameroon, Nigeria, and I think Central African Republic were there. You know, there's a statement by the president of Nigeria, the ambassador of Italy to Nigeria spoke a whole statement. They put in 1.5 million euros, I'm sorry, for the original feasibility study. But now that this memorandum of understanding has been signed, it can move forward a lot more rapidly. And basically, you know, China's going to have to go in there and, you know, give some loan and get some loan guarantees or something and work it out, because you have several nations involved. But don't expect anything to come to you from, you know, the big money centers. They're not going to do it. I mean, one reason they're prejudiced against you, and two, they're hoarding all their money. They keep their own bubble from bursting from one day to the next. So that begs the question of the second of LaRouche's 4 laws, which we talk about Hamiltonian banking. Every nation's allowed to have a national bank to generate credit for stuff, you know, that, you know, you have, which you can do to a great extent. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's time for an ad for science because I mean it's very important that people understand that this prohibition against development that you've been referring to is precisely a population reduction policy, and that's what the IMF and World Bank have been about for, you know, last 40, 50 years. And you know, I think you know, you can put AOC in that category, right?
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Mass murder, but she's just the most ridiculous extension of that policy. But the people that are behind her and the people behind them, you know, are absolutely committed to mass murder. They want population reduction because they don't have the capability to you know, with their primitive outlook, this oligarchical primitive outlook, to allow for population development.
Hey Joe, speaking of feeding people, did you find out who invented pasta?
Who invented pasta?
Was it China or Italy?
Well, you know, go ahead.
The Chinese had noodles already.
They had rice noodles, yeah.
Yeah, and what they found in Italy was the wheat that became, you know, they put the two together, and I don't know which one it was,
The
but.
concept, yeah.
It was a memorandum of understanding between.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they didn't have tomato sauce until they discovered
There you
America.
go,
That's
there
right.
you go.
It was all Alfredo and garlic, but no tomatoes, you know.
They had Alfredo sauce.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about like the division of labor politically in Italy? Like, why did the president meet with Xi Jinping, not the prime minister?
They both did. What I showed you at the first image was the prime minister, whose name is Giuseppe Conte, right? Who's with the Lega. There's actually, it's kind of like two prime ministers, or as Liliana said, two premiers,
Deputy prime minister.
right? One from each party.
But usually you have the head of state.
Is it a uniform?
He's the head of state.
Yeah.
Is it a unity government or something?
Well,
Or
no,
they-
it's two parties. That's what the parliamentary thing is. It's always.
Conte isn't from either of the two
Yeah.
parties,
Right.
and then you have a deputy prime minister.
No,
Mozzarella's not from
No,
either.
mozzarella is from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and then
But he's
Conte
the head
is
of
not from
state,
either
so
the
that's
Liga
what
or
they
the.
meant.
Oh, he's not? I
No,
thought he was
he's
with
not.
Liga.
And then you have a deputy prime minister, Salvini, and another one that are from each one represents two parties.
Conte's not with either party? How can you not be in a party? I don't know.
He was a
That's how they
professor
worked it out.
because
Oh.
he was a compromise.
So it was a compromise deal. Yeah, I know it was a very fragile thing, and that's the thing with parliamentary government, you know, because any day a party can say, well, that's it, I'm taking my marbles and go home, you know, and you just pull out of the government and poof, it's
But the
it's
reason
over, right?
why he met with Xi is because they're both head of state.
Yeah,
President meets the president.
right. And it's just that the Chinese thing is so enormous, right? It's bigger than all the partisan squabbling. And right after this, he went to Italy, signed this, had this beautiful ceremony. Then he went to Nice, or was it Monaco? He went to Monaco, which is this teeny little, you know, fief. We all remember Princess Grace and
Yeah,
Prince
right.
Rainier, right? And then went to France, and Merkel and Macron were going to read him the riot act. No more, you know, bilateral agreements. You better behave, and you know, and so forth, right? And he's in there talking about win-win cooperation, and we can have credit for big projects and create jobs. And they come out of that meeting and say, oh, the new Silk Road is very important for our future, you know, as long as we have good governance and transparency, you know. So, I mean, I don't think Xi Jinping is naive because, you know, but it's our job to do something about this neocon problem here, you know, which is everywhere. You know, I mean, I mean, the Democrats really got to do something. What are they going to do in the wake of what the disgrace that they've just been through? You know, they've got to rediscover Franklin Roosevelt. They've got to rediscover, you know, and certain people like the lady that you tried to talk to last week, the congresswoman, you know, Lizzie Fletcher, you know,
Yeah.
we got to give them the ideas, right? Because, I mean, otherwise you're just going to end up with just, as we often get in the field, they all suck, you know, everyone's corrupt. There's nothing you can do, you know, and of course it's not true, but they have to be given a glimmer into this higher reality that we've helped, you know, set into motion. And everyone has to help us on that. So we're going to, last thing is that, you know, we did this, we did the damage with this, we've been putting this thing out here. This was the one on the streets educating people, but now we're going to try to come out with an exoneration, not try, we have to do it. We're going to come out with a pamphlet on the LaRouche case. Exoneration as the key. You know,
How
with,
much will that cost?
oh, how much you got?
Just credit card.
No, we take record.
Yeah,
I think it's,
$1 million there.
I think it said 20,000 bucks or something, you know, for their first run.
He says $1 million lira.
Right.
For 10,000.
Right. So that's what we need to do, and it's fun because it forced us to have the kind of conversations we want to have with people in the field, where it's not just us commenting on, you know, what they're doing. It's about what we're doing, right? And so I hope you guys, particularly Sharon and other people that, you know, maybe you didn't know some of this history today about, you know, our case and so forth, see the power of getting the truth out about this. And actually I have here, this is from Ramsey Clark. People remember Ramsey Clark? Ramsey Clark was the Attorney General of the United States under the latter part of the Lyndon Johnson administration, which means when Selma, Alabama happened, you know, he was the one that walked the 50-mile walk with Amelia Robinson and the rest of them from Selma to Montgomery.
Wow.
So he says, among other things, some of the stuff he did wasn't so good. But when LaRouche's case, and when LaRouche was in prison, we wanted to appeal it. We went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was never, ever, ever granted a hearing of appeal. Because Bush was president then, that means we could have had cross-examination about Bush's role, Iran-Contra, all the stuff, right? Here's what Ramsey Clark just said on the death of Lyndon LaRouche. Quote, "I feel very saddened about the loss of Lyndon LaRouche. These things come in their time. Everyone's death diminishes us all, and Mr. LaRouche will certainly find his place in history. He was treated unfairly in his life for his vision and his work. His courage is especially notable in the face of pervasive and vicious propaganda. Time will correct this. In his memory, the truth will out." It's from Ramsey Clark.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Right.